Working Cows Podcast, episode 108.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows Podcast, powered by the Global Ag Network, here with an episode for you guys on improving pastures with cover crops. We're going to talk to David Kleinschmidt. He is a contract consultant with Understanding Ag LLC. Understanding Ag LLC is a cooperation of Gabe Brown, Ray Archuletta, Alan Williams, and some others that are involved there. And David is a contract consultant with them, helping people figure out how to improve their soil health, among other things. So, David, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows Podcast.
Thanks for having me today, Clay.
So we are going to talk today about improving pastures with cover crops. Where do you start? Is there some soil testing that goes on or first, or where do you start when you're thinking about how to improve a pasture with cover crops?
Yeah, generally I like to get kind of a background of how that pasture has been grazed traditionally, and looking at kind of the class of the animals that are being grazed as well. If they're doing rotation or if they're just a continuous graze. I generally like to run a PLFA test and a Haney soil health test as well to kind of understand what's going on within the biology of the soil. And, if I'm not able to be at the farm, I always recommend, a farmer to go out there into his pastures or paddocks with a spade and sink a spade in the ground and take a look at his soil and just see, how much, cover or armor he has on the top of the soil and how much, aggregates he has. And then, looking at potentially compaction layers in the soil profile as well. So those are some of the first things I look at. I also pay attention to, the aroma of the soil and if it's got a sweet smell or a sour smell or just a neutral smell and no smell at all, So those are some of the things I take a look at first.
And what are some of the steps you take to improve pasture with soil after you've kind of determined where it's at? Does it kind of depend on the status of the soil and then how you move on from there, or are there some kind of bigger picture general directions you can move in to start improving that pasture?
Well, so generally we can improve pastures with the livestock themselves. Which is that herd impact and giving rest. The adaptive multi-paddock grazing type situation works really well. But, in a lot of cases, sometimes we have to, we'll seed some, interseed some cover crops into it, if you will, whether that's radish, turnip, or even some annual ryegrass or oats, just something to fill some voids, fill some gaps in there as well, to help stimulate add some more diversity and stimulate that biology in there. It kind of just depends on what species are growing out there as well, I guess.
So regarding the cover crops, is it no-till? Is it broadcasting, frost seeding? Some pros and cons there. What are you seeing work well?
The no-till probably works the best. It just depends on there's always a lot of depends when it comes to talking about cover crops and things like that. It always just depends, it seems like. But if we have a really heavy thatch layer, sometimes a no-till drill is going to work, and we might have to allow the animals to graze out a little bit tighter to be able to get that drill into the ground. No-till drill this time of the year works really well. Broadcast works okay if you can time it with the rainfall. If you broadcast and follow with livestock and let the livestock trample the seed in, that works as well. Frost seeding seems to work okay with our clovers and legumes. small seeded legumes. Some grasses, oats, okay. Aerial application's been kind of hit and miss. It really depends on the weather at that time.
Sure. And what about the animal density required if you're going to broadcast and then follow it with animals? What kind of a animal density are you talking about to get the effect you need to help plant some of those seeds?
Yeah, so generally probably nothing less than a 50,000 pound stock density per acre. You could go up to as high as 500,000, but keep them moving, but generally between that 50,000 and 100,000 seems pretty safe on a day-to-day move.
And what about the timing of seeding some warm and cool season grasses? Do you have anything there as far as what time of year works better?
Yeah, we obviously have to watch the weather, the temperature, as far as that goes. The warm seasons, in my part of the world here, just east of St. Louis, middle to end of May, about the time that we would typically plant corn here, works really well for our sorghum sedans, millets, and those types of grasses, and cowpeas, mung beans, those warm season legumes, sun hemp, and even throwing some sunflowers in there. So if we start at like towards the end of May, we can plant those all the way up through middle of July. A lot of times we can follow some wheat harvest with those warm season cocktail mixes and have some really good opportunities to graze them throughout the fall yet, going into winter time as well. The cool seasons, generally around here, we would have started flying on some cover crops into standing crops the 1st of September. A lot of times we've got some dairy guys around us and even some beef guys that chop some silage, and they'll go in and drill in their cover crops right after silage, and that happens about the 1st of September. With the rainfall we've had this year, we're about 15 to 20 days behind. So, everything's being pushed back, which kind of limits us when we start looking at our first frost date this fall, of what brassicas, what legumes we can put in a mix, and even annual ryegrass, trying to get it established before that first killing frost is pretty critical as well. I really like annual ryegrass on a lot of my mixes, especially for grazing. It just, I think it is Rick Haney says that roots fix dirt, and there's not many other species out there as far as an annual crop that can put down the amount of roots that annual ryegrass does in just 1 year's time frame.
And what are some of the things that annuals are doing as a cover crop? How are they helping you out?
So they're really good at creating a lot of root exudates. So when you think about the plants and what we're trying to do, we're basically harvesting sunlight energy, and through photosynthesis, we're and bringing in CO2, combining that with water, and that plant can then release those root exudates into the soil profile, which feeds that biology in that, whether it's bacteria, nematodes, fungi, protozoa, all types of bacteria in that soil profile. So it's feeding those, these basically, sugars and carbohydrates, proteins type molecules for whatever that plant needs. So during different times of the year, during its different growth stages, it's going to release different root exudates for whatever type of mineral it needs. And so it feeds biology those root exudates in exchange for the minerals. So it's all part of this whole carbon cycle, to be able to feed that biology, which is improving our mineral cycle. And it also improves our water cycle as well, as the biology in the soil is building stable aggregates to protect it from, weather patterns, whether it's harsh rains, winds, things like that.
Do you always want some annuals in a cover crop mix to kind of jumpstart that biology?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll add to that too, the more diverse cover crops that we can have, the more diverse our microbial communities will be in our soil profile as well. If you think about even all communities that we live in, it's a diversity of people. And if everyone was the same, things kind of go in monoculture pretty quick and things just don't work out so well. So we have to have that diversity of different cover crop species feeding out different root exudates at all times. We want different leaf patterns on top of the soil. They're collecting sunlight at all times differently, and we want different root structures below the soil profile, some deep, some fibrous, some short, some tap roots. We want diversity of it all. We look at like fallow fields and the weeds that kind of come up into those fields, and that's nature's first defense of trying to armor and protect herself. And those weeds will all have a different type of root structure as well. So we're just trying to mimic nature by design of what is willing to grow out there on its own.
Yeah, it might have been you. I don't remember. Somewhere I saw someone post something about weeds being nature's cover crop, or nature's, like you said, first line of defense. So they're telling us there's something they're trying to fix in there, that's going on.
Absolutely. And when we really look at weeds too, I mean, cattle will consume mare's tail and giant ragweed and some of these plants that we would consider as weeds, but they are full of secondary and tertiary nutrients that can have significant medicinal purposes as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Any tricks on that? Is it just an issue of forcing them onto it and animal density, or is there another tip or trick that you've got in your hat?
Stock density works probably the best when animals are competing for food against each other. Everything all of a sudden becomes forage, and they're not just picking and choosing what they're wanting to eat. They're eating a little bit of something on every bite. And as they start grabbing a hold of, giant ragweed or lamb's quarter or water hemp or something like that, I guess they're like kids or whatever that have been exposed to it their whole life. They kind of have that taste that they like it, and they'll eat it on their own. I've seen cattle be moved, early in the morning to a fresh paddock, and I've watched cows go right to the first thing they'd eat, or the lamb's quarter, which also could be that the bricks were higher in that for that time or whatever. But, that cow's willing to eat what she needs, and kind of compete against the others. And I know there's some other tricks that people have used as far as, putting some molasses on plants or something to get them to take that first bite, and that works as well too.
How much of a mix are you usually starting out with somebody who's, say, been in a continuously grazed paddock that they're trying to get stuff rolling in it well? How much of a diversity in your mix are you starting out with?
So usually no more than 10 to 15% of legumes in there. The majority of it is going to be a grass, and maybe only about 10% being a broadleaf brassica type, or even less than that probably. But so I like to have at least 3 different grass species, 2 to 3 different legumes, and a couple different types of brassicas as well.
Sounds good. What species are they improving pastures with that grow through the allelopathic effects of cool season grasses such as brome or wheatgrass? That's a question from my private Facebook group, and so I was feeling obliged to ask it. Well,
so I guess I haven't had a whole lot of experience with those types of issues. It seems like we're doing more with, like I said, ryegrass, and not having as much of an issue. Maybe it's as well, some of these pastures are being grazed down pretty hard at the time of interseeding, so those plants aren't thriving, I guess you would say, and competitive. So I think that has a lot to do with the success of seeding those cover crops.
had somebody else reach out to me and ask if we had any episodes that touch on where to start when trying to convert to regenerative practices. And we've kind of covered a couple of these things, but I'll ask if there's any more steps in between, I guess. He says, to my understanding, getting the animals rotating is step one, and then step two would be to begin using cover crops to repair the soil. Hopefully step three would be to wean off of the use of chemical pesticides, herbicides, and wormers. So anything in between there that might help, or anything that you can think of that you would add in as a step in between any of those?
So if it's a livestock guy that is not doing any row crop and he's got the pasture established already, just the daily moves of cattle and stock density can really improve the forage quality and quantity of forages that are out in the pasture without having to spend a lot of money on additional seeds. And like I said, the herbicides that need to be used, your cattle are or your sheep or whatever will start to trample on some of those quote unquote weeds. They're going to start eating on some of them. They're going to manage themselves pretty quick. Fertilizer, when you start going down that path too, of having, at least 50, like I said, up to 100,000, maybe more pound stock density and more or less mob grazing and moving them daily. You look at the manure, the concentration of manure in that small of an area, and looking at what the value of manure is. And in one pat of manure, you're looking at about, 0.23 pounds of N, 0.15 pounds of phosphorus, and 0.52 pounds of potassium. And our goal is to at least try to get one manure pat in a square yard. And so if we're continuously grazing a pasture, it might take up to 27 years to achieve one manure pad in a square yard of that pasture. But by doing this and rotating them 3 times throughout those pastures through those paddocks a year, we can achieve that within a year. So that's pretty significant right there when you're looking at how to reduce the dollars and really stimulate your soils right there. So it's, there's, the soil health principles, but then there's also the rules of adaptive grazing for regenerative ag. And that has to do with being disruptive, cascading and compounding effects, and diversity. So, everything that we do is either going to have a positive or negative effect, and it's never neutral. So that's part of the rule of cascading and compounding effects. The whole disruption is, how much stock density are you putting on an area? Sometimes we do what's called a paddock inside of a paddock. If we've got a problem area where we've got a bunch of weeds or maybe some brush coming in, we might, have a paddock inside that paddock that we put animals in there for, a short period of time at, 1,000,000 pound stock density or 500,000, just enough to get that impact on there. And then we open it up to the rest of the paddock. But that can have significant effects on that area going forward for years to come.
Sure. Yep. No, that's good. I appreciate that. And then you mentioned disruptive, cascading, and compounding effects, and then diversity. Is that, can you touch on the diversity?
Yep. So the diversity has to do with the diversity of forages, for one, that are in the that you have on your pastures as well. But also, it can even have an effect of what you're grazing. If you're grazing, mama cows, dry cows versus cow-calf pairs or stockers, or maybe even having a flirt where you're following up with sheep or goats or something after you graze the cows through there. That diversity can, just like, we talk about the soils and the biology, and then the forages have biology, the bacteria and everything on them as well. That whole time that cow is eating, she's shedding off diverse microbes, either off her hair coat, through her mouth or through her back end. And so it's always adding more diverse species of microbial life and everything to stimulate that soil as well.
Could you talk a little bit more about the cascading and compounding effects? What are you talking about there, I guess?
Yep. So basically that has to do with it's never singular. It's kind of like we wake up in the morning, we walk out into our pastures when we see a weed and we spray a weed, that will have more effect than just on that weed. We're affecting that whole biology and everything else. So whenever we do something, we have to think about how is it affecting kind of the ecosystem as a whole. And so it's always going to be, either positive or negative. It's never neutral, never singular. I've heard it phrased as, if you forget your wife's birthday one year, she's probably not going to forget that the rest of her life. And that kind of goes with the whole till death do us part, and maybe after that too. We really don't know. But, that's part of like that cascading and compounding effects.
And so then forgetting your wife's birthday and your anniversary, in succession would be a compounding.
Yeah, that'd be a bad day.
Yeah. Sure. So would you recommend that somebody work towards weaning off of the use of chemical pesticides, herbicides, and wormer, all three, one at a time? Is there a process that you guys take people through generally? Some of those things?
Yeah, so, genetics will play a big role into that with the livestock, especially with flies, and you can start picking out cattle that, for one, that might have more fly pressure or lice problems, and automatically just cull those animals. They're not providing anything good to your herd, and they're just going to pass that on to their offspring. So we kind of follow a strict cull protocol there. We start to wean off of some of the porons, or use some things that might be safer. But with the daily moves and moving the cattle just every day, we're moving them away from those manure pads. So the fly pressure is going to start becoming less and less. And you'll also start noticing things like, cowbirds might start following your herd around. And they're going to be, either sitting on the backs of a cow eating flies, or, have swallows or dragonflies that fly around and catching flies as well, or they're scratching through manure pads. Another thing is, as we're doing this, we don't want to allow the cows to consume any more than 50% of the forages. So if they're eating towards the top of that plant always, let's say the top third of that plant, well, then their faces aren't down there where the parasites live, so we don't have to worry about deworming as much either. We can see those effects really the first year.
Is there one of those that you would choose first, or is there something that you would focus on before you started to worry about the pesticides, herbicides, and wormer?
Yeah, usually if we're running the cattle through the chute in the springtime before we kick them out to the pasture, we can forget about, for one, if depending on when we're doing run cattle through the chute, we don't need to put the fly tags in. A lot of times they're way too early anyways. And the resistance in them seems to be pretty high. So, we'll save a little bit of money there. If we're not grazing short, like I said, we're in a good growth stage of the grasses as well and forages, we can kick the dewormer off right there off the start in the spring. And the fly sprays and that stuff, a lot of times that, right now I see all kinds of people spraying their cows, and well, in my area it starts about 1st of July, and people usually start talking about pink eye issues and going out and mowing their pastures and everything. And a lot of that can be alleviated with just, really monitoring when you're grazing and what the forages that you're grazing early in the spring, and taking care of kind of that gut pH, if you will, and making sure that cow's having a good day. And, just like you and I, if we happen to, get sick and have diarrhea, same thing if that cow's, eating a high protein diet and she's squirting out the back and has a messy back end. It's affecting her gut, which is kind of slowing down a lot of things. And we can start to see, I've heard it explained that within 50 to 60 days later, that impact of that whole change of her gut pH and it kind of allows that virus to start in there. We can see an impact of, either pink eye or foot rot as well. So there's a lot of management plays that can happen right there that we can protect ourselves against.
Like the pest life cycle is kind of what you're banking on as far as moving them away from those manure pats. And so can you talk a little bit about that and how we can change our thinking about that so that we know that we're moved on from them before they're really an issue? Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I realize that water is always an issue in paddocks. So we're always trying to basically graze away from a water source to a certain extent. So the cattle are going to be walking past those areas that they've grazed, where the fly is laid and the larva's in there and everything. Most of the times, those manure pats will start to break down, especially when we have start using less of the synthetics and everything. And start bringing in some different dung beetles. And there's a whole host of different dung beetle species out there that can rapidly break down those pats and dry them out. And then those larvae have nothing to live on, basically. So, if we can dry out pat within 4 days or 5, we can be moved on far enough away from that initial impact there that the flies then don't seem to be as much of a problem.
We spent most of our time here talking about moving cattle regularly and that really solving a lot of the problems that we're trying to fix with chemical, synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, wormers, and some of those things. And we didn't really touch on as much the use of cover crops. Is that further down the road? I mean, in this particular line of questioning, we talked about cover crops earlier, but is that further down the road in your mind, or is that not step 2? Is step 1 move the cattle regularly, and that really takes care of step 3 with the weaning off of the synthetics?
Yeah, I mean, step 1, as we're moving cattle regularly, and even having some, if we can have an area that we just let rest for a long period of time, longer than the rest of our pastures, within a year, we start seeing significant differences in our soil profile, where we've got more aggregate structure. We can throw a spade in the ground and it takes nothing to push it into the ground. We start building that soil carbon that way. And, we don't need to do as much with adding a brassica or something like that in there to try to break up the compaction. And if it's an area where, like I said, it's traditionally grazed pasture and it's pretty tight, using those cover crops, pulling the cattle off there, letting those cover crops get good and established, then coming back in and grazing those, either late fall or next spring, can really start to have a significant impact there. A lot of times I think most people have established grasses and they'll have some compaction issue that they're dealing with. In my environment, it's more of a calcium-magnesium ratio in the soil. We can have some high mag soils that tend to bind really tight. And then, we might have to apply like a gypsum or something to be able to get that calcium in there to start building that soil and allowing that soil to breathe a little bit more. But the a brassica in there at I don't generally like to go more than a 2-pound rate together, just because of the amount of protein and fiber that's in that. You make the cow pretty loose as well with that. So,
do you see most of the use of synthetics in the industry as people chasing a monoculture, essentially?
Essentially, yeah. It kind of it works all the same with even corn and soybean rotation around here. I mean, the use of synthetic is huge. And we can look at fields and compare them to fence lines where the organic carbon and the carbon in that soil is completely depleted. And that was a man-made issue. I often use a quote that, what was it? That no civilization has ever outlived its soils.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think as we start to really pay attention to our soils and our soil degradation, that people are really starting to realize that what we've done over the last 100 years, 200 years here has really caused some significant damage, and that we need to replace it if we're going to have a serious conversation about sustainable agriculture. And I think that's where regenerative agriculture has its place, is because it's not maintaining the same, it's building new, it's life, it's fun. But the more that we just have those monoculture species, the more that we're selecting for the diseases and the pathogens that we have, and we're selecting for the resistance in the weeds, because we're just spraying the same stuff over and over again. Because we don't have that carbon in our soils, we're having to apply more of the nutrients because we don't have a mineral cycle that's functional, because we're lacking the biology because of the monocultures that we have. We have to have more diversity.
So if we stop chasing the monoculture, how crazy will our neighbors think we are?
Oh, they think we're nuts. But I don't really care. I always tell my a lot of the farmers I work with and everything, the neighbor's not paying our bills. Let the neighbors talk about their yields and everything, and we'll talk about our profits. But we're humble enough that we don't want to talk about that either. So we just let them talk.
Yep, absolutely. Could you talk a little bit about your work with Understanding Ag?
Yeah, so I am a contract consultant with Understanding Ag, which is great, with the resources between Dr. Alan Williams and Ray Archuletta, Gabe Brown, and Dave Brandt. And I think there's 14 other consultants, contract consultants with us now as well. Everybody brings something different to the table. We all have our strengths, we all have our weaknesses, and we all learn from each other, from being from very diverse parts of the world, or the country basically, which can be like very diverse parts of the world. You go from someplace like, the East Coast or something that might get 40 inches of rainfall and maybe a hurricane, that gives you 80, to someplace out in, the desert in New Mexico or something, and it gets 4 or 5,
right.
So it's fun to kind of learn how people manage different environments and how you have to. The principles all work the same when we talk a lot about the soil health principles, and that's the core of the business, is building soil health. And those principles are all the same no matter where you're at, no matter if you get 2 inches of rainfall or 200 inches of rainfall, which is really excessive, but, or if you're in a cold environment with a short growing season, or a long environment in the South with a really long growing season. They all are the same. You just have to apply them. Right.
Yep. Anything coming up that you want me to link? Show notes page for today, which is workingcows.net/108.
I would mention too that, every month with Understanding Ag, which is part of the Soil Health Academy as well, we have a Soil Health Academy school, which is a 3-day course. This month there's one in Kansas, and I believe it might be filled. I think next month is October. In October is down in Missouri, but usually there's one across the country, and it's pretty amazing because we've been bringing people from other countries and everything to almost every one of the classes, at least one person from another country. And, the networking opportunities are huge there, to learn how people are doing things in different areas, and, just being able to bring it back and apply that to your farm is amazing.
Yeah, I'll have a link in the show notes page to the upcoming schools page on Soil Health Academy, and the next one in October that you were talking about is in Missouri, October 15th through the 17th, with looks like it's at Ray Archuletta's place. So, yep, So I'll link to all that at the show notes page for today, workingcows.net/108. David, thanks for your time today. Did we miss anything?
I don't believe so. I appreciate it. Thank you.
I really appreciate David's time and his understanding, and I really encourage you to get out to an Understanding Ag LLC workshop near you. As he said, have one about every month in different places around the country. And if you're interested in attending one of those, links will be at the show notes page for today. workingcows.net/108. workingcows.net/108 is the show notes page for today, and you can grab a link to the next school in your area there. Coming up next week, really excited about the launch of a new podcast and interviewing the host of the Ag State of Mind podcast about how he has come to start this podcast and his motivations for it. So really look forward to next week with Jason Meadows of the Ag State of Mind podcast, and his podcast will be launching on the day we release that episode. So kind of coinciding there with his launch. So if you go out looking for it yet, you might not quite find it yet, but it will be there when we release the episode next week. We'll see you then on the Working Cows podcast.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.